Good morning. I'm Simon St. Laurent, Senior Editor at O'Reilly Media Inc. I'm here today with Mike Amundsen, Principal API Architect at Layer 7 Technologies and a longtime advocate for hypermedia, RESTful approaches, and similar ways of making your architectures cleaner, better, easier to manage. Mike, you've been telling this story for a while. One of my favorite things about it is that it's kind of an old story. It goes back a ways, and I'd like to kind of get a sense of how people can approach this thing that they keep seeing as new, but really isn't.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, right? So probably the phrase that most people know is REST. So that's Fielding's 2001 dissertation on software architecture styles actually has a chapter in it called REST, which was his example of how you could build a distributed system based on some constraints that are selected in order to induce properties that you picked for requirements. So it's this sort of complicated, abstract PhD work that boils down to one example. What he was really doing was just trying to pick up all these pieces that go all the way back to Vannevar Bush and the Manhattan Project, who came up with this article called the Memex, which was printed in the Atlantic Monthly. You've got guys like Douglas Engelbart, the guy who worked at Xerox PARC and invented the mouse, who actually turned some of Vannevar Bush's ideas into reality, and it's based on Ted Nelson's concept of links. And Ted was this sort of surf guy out in California. He said if screens are the surfboards of the internet, and that's why we surf the web, because of what Ted said. So really, Roy is just sort of the contemporary in that line that stretches all the way back to 1945. What really made Roy unique was he applied the same rigorous sort of enterprise-level principles about architecture to the notion of hypermedia and actually used it to sort of describe the web we have today. So it's a fantastic mix of that enterprise architecture world with the sort of Ted Nelson's cyberpunk culture web that we use today. So it's really a fun place to be in.
Well, it's definitely taking concepts that worked on the web for humans and applying them to the web for computers. And I think a lot of people get very petrified as they try to make that jump. So I guess what I'm wondering is, people are taking these systems that they've frequently already built. They're often not greenfield projects. And they're trying to figure out, I've built this tangle. How do I untangle it? How do I make these things go smoother? So where do you suggest that they start in that process?
Yeah, so if you look at the way most web systems, whether they're sort of based, on the internal SOA model or this sort of the open web kind of experience, they all kind of boil down to this sort of RPC-based model where it's a function call that people make. And it's got, the URL becomes the function name and sometimes has arguments. And it sort of works with this RMI and Corba and all the things that we know about object-oriented. So most of us have that today. The nice thing is if you want to move towards this more hypermedia style, which is really what Fielding tries to bring to the table in his REST design, hypermedia doesn't really care about the URL as much as it cares about what you're trying to do, the action you're trying to do. That's why we have forms in hypermedia and links. It turns out the same URL that you use to create that RPC works just fine in a hypermedia form. And you can start to include some of these hypermedia controls, these links and forms, in messages that you're just returning JSON or XML today. You start including those as additional bits of information, and then clients can start to look for them and use them. In other words, you can actually mix the two. You can have a message that still returns the big block of JSON objects that we know, and then on the end maybe has some links, which are really instructions for the future, or instructions for the next thing, and clients, in the next version, clients can start to look at them. So it's actually kind of easy to start to slipstream this process in, and eventually you can build up this knowledge in your client base where people know, hey, can you just give me a link or a form? Because then it'll be easier for me to do the next step. And I think that's what we see happening a lot, both in the enterprise and also in the web as a whole. GitHub and a lot of these other locations are starting to slipstream this hypermedia data into their existing objects. You don't have to use it, but you want to build a client that uses it, you can. So I think we're seeing that sort of adaptability kind of go into the system over the last few years.
Great. One thing I'm seeing is it seems with REST, more people actually build their own tools. They don't just slap a library in to establish hypermedia connectivity. I mean, it's clear that some libraries, I mean, like Rails, obviously, frameworks have their own API expectations, that kind of thing. But it seems like people are, building more precisely than I think they were when they thought it was just a function call. So
that's definitely happening. There's a tension, actually, that I think that's going on. There's a new, what I call sort of the new crop or the new kids in town hypermedia REST designs. HAL, Hypertext Application Language, is really the most popular right now. I registered one called Collection JSON. There's another JSON one called Siren. These are very opinionated message formats that take advantage of hypermedia. Well, there aren't a lot of libraries that yet use those. I know Yehuda Katz, Steve Klabnik, the guys in the Rails community are actually working to get Ember.js and parts of Rails to be really, really friendly with HAL. So right now, what happens is we all sort of build our one-off libraries to try to solve this problem. And very often that means we solve a particular problem, not a generic one. It's not like we're writing a browser. We're just writing our client to handle, accounting or to-do lists or content management. But with the work that Yehuda and other guys are doing, I think you're going to see in the next year or two generic libraries that you can plug in. If you get to a server and its server uses HAL, you can pull Ember.js and a couple of gems from Ruby, and you can actually start to talk to that server very, very quickly. So that sort of returns that low barrier of entry that we really expect from the web and starts to put it for the human web. And starts to create that low barrier of entry for the machine web. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next year or two.
That sounds excellent. That sounds like a great way for people to get moving in it. And I like that. The scenario you suggested where people are finding the links at the bottom and then saying, "What can I do with those?" and moving. But they also kind of need to see the overall power of it. And you've reminded me of something else. So it's like Ember and Rails. There was a lot of sort of moving to, it feels like there's a lot of movement towards a complete stack in the web browser. We see MVC frameworks and things like that in the browser, and we have an MVC stack on the server, and it seems like there are a lot of ways to communicate between those two pieces, and we're moving towards a layer cake where we kind of need to figure out what the frosting is in between the layers, maybe.
Yeah, actually, I think you're onto something. So one of the things we've seen over the last few years, as all of us sort of struggle to figure out how to make the machine web, sort of the next level up, the application web really work, are lots of opinionated libraries, whether it's Microsoft's MVVM, whether it's, the original Rails pattern of applying MVC to distributed systems rather than just MVC on a screen. Everybody's trying to get a handle on this. So I think that's actually a good sign from you. That's disruptive in the community, right? So I think what's happening is with designs like HAL and CJ and Siren, and there's an RDF or a JSON LD one that's coming up called Hydra, which I'm kind of interested in as well. As we start to see these come up, libraries will start to develop that make that connection easier too. One of the challenges of MVC and MVVM is that they're really, the shared understanding is the object model on either end. Mm-hmm. And that can be challenging because if you change the object model in the server, you've kind of invalidated clients. With HAL and these other formats, the shared understanding becomes the message and not the object model on either end. So if we can create libraries that speak in messages, you can change asynchronously. You can sort of get other parts of the web that we have for the humans today, which is the ability to rearrange the message, rearrange the screen, or change storage, or write a new client and it still works. We'll start to get some of that with the machine web too. So I think you're right. People are struggling to find that thing in the middle, that icing, and I think that icing is actually the message itself. And we're getting better messages now.
Great. Yeah, it seems like it sort of loosens the connections between these pieces and lets developers have a little more freedom than they've had for a while.
Yeah, and I think it also that low barrier is the real challenge right now. There's a real high bar to write a hypermedia system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm at the Fluent conference, I'll be talking about it's not really rocket science to build a client, but it does depend on some certain things that we don't have easily today. That's why we're writing a lot of one-offs. But as we lower that barrier, we get rid of plumbing. So then we start to focus again on user experience, and we focus on the things that are really important about our app, not the plumbing or how to wire it up or how to manage change or versioning and all those other things. So we're just in that period where I think we're about to sort of make that leap. And we just need some more experiments, some more time, and some more work. And I think it's actually going very, very well.
Yeah, well, you've written a fair amount about different approaches, different tool sets. You did the building hypermedia applications with Node. Right now, you're working on the RESTful web APIs with Lenny Richardson. How do you see these different tool sets? How do you see developers and tool sets interacting at this point? How do you if you get to go into a conversation, how do you help people find the right, well, we're trying to get away from plumbing, but how do you help them find the right wrenches?
Right. Actually, my work with Layer 7 is a lot about helping clients do just that, figure out how to wire things together and how to do this in an effective and efficient way with enough coupling, but not too much, right? That's sort of like just, complicated enough kind of idea. And what we're finding is if you focus on the message in between, you can use all sorts of technologies. You can use Rails on one end and C# on the other and Erlang on one end, and JavaScript on the other. So it's actually making it easier to focus on the talents and the skills that you have in your community as long as the message is the same. So what we're telling people is focus on setting up an environment, like on the enterprise side. Focus on setting up an environment that looks very, very similar to the way service-oriented architecture works. You've got a compiled layer of services on the bottom, but what we're seeing now is a sort of a scripted layer, whether it's in Node or in Rails or in ASP.NET or even PHP, a sort of a composer layer on the top that serves this interface, which is your API. And very often that API will be, RPC-based, but sometimes it'll be hypermedia-based as well. And what happens is you actually set up these asynchronicities. I can compile my business objects at a low speed, script these at a relatively high speed, create interfaces quickly, and I can start to do the same thing on client sides. I can serve a mobile as well as a desktop. I can serve a tablet. So I have a lot more freedom, and we see several very large companies sort of investing in this environment where it's sort of easy to create new things. It's cheap to create higher on the stack. It's almost like a DevOps version of creating interfaces for machines. It's really very, very exciting. So it's not so much the technology you pick, like the product you pick, but the approach you take. And that approach is really a refinement of the same SOA principles we've had before, but sort of adding the things we're learning about that human web that are actually becoming a machinable reality.
Well, it seems like kind of the classic small case for these principles is a single web application where you know what the server is going to be. You're building a client that fits that server or the other way around. But what I keep finding happens with these things is that what was originally just one server, one client, grows over time. And other people, even if there isn't like a formally defined API, will say, hey, I need the data from that thing. Can I get into it? What are my tool sets going to look like? And, on the far end of that, you get into kind of SOA, you get into enterprise architecture, large-scale systems with lots of different message passing. And, yeah.
Yeah. So you're exactly right. I mean, that's exactly what we see. What happens is somebody's just solving a problem. That's all they're really interested in. They're not trying to, cure cancer. I just got to get an app up and running. But all of a sudden somebody does that. They say, you know what? It would be really cool if we had this on mobile. Or, can you give that to me in the CSV because I need to upload that into a bunch of spreadsheets or something. So what happens is humans actually start to negotiate with you. Can you make your app do this for me? What's really neat is HTTP itself is built to negotiate that. Can you give me the sales figures in CSV? Can you give me the sales figures in HAL? Can you give me the sales figures in a PNG? So what we're seeing people doing is actually building up these systems, even if they're just starting with a single app, that sort of treat this negotiation as a possibility. One of the reactions to this whole challenge is responsive design, right? Responsive web design. And that's the notion that I'm going to create this really rich response and let the device sort out how to use it, right? If it's a small device, I'll just use parts of it. If it's a tablet and it's landscape, so on and so forth. What we're actually seeing people do is not ask the client to sort all those details out, but have the client tell them, what version do you want to see of this? And we'll sort out a version for that. To go on the big scale side, this is exactly what Netflix is doing. Netflix has sort of created this whole raft of almost device-specific APIs that talk to their general back end. They've sort of done this on a huge scale because hardware performance is really, really important to them. We don't all have to do it the way Netflix does, but that's a good example of sort of adapting this components, composability, focused API pattern to something like streaming services. And I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Well, the other thing that I see sometimes questioned is we think we can make hypermedia work within an organization where people are actively talking to each other anyway. You can have those kinds of conversations, but people get very paranoid about doing these things on the public web. You hear, well, you can do that, but only if there's a dictator defining the format, or you can do that.
Right. So, there's definitely a friction there. And so what we find is if you focus on sort of usability of the API, we know about user experience, right? So if you focus on developer experience, we've got a great guy at Layer 7, Alex Gaber, who does developer experience kind of work. And my buddy Ronnie's been doing some research too. Ronnie Mitri's based in London. And what we're seeing people do is, if you really focus on developer experience right now, you want to get your API out there and you want to get it adopted, the smart strategy, the usable API, is an RPC API. Because that's what people understand. That's what they want today. That's the shared understanding. I understand HTTP methods and payloads and get and post and delete. And if you put a hypermedia system out there, people get confused because the level of adoption and the level of shared understanding is not there yet. So what we're seeing is that same thing we talked about earlier. People starting with that RPC pattern and then adding on some hypermedia later on. So the smart strategy is to do just what you said. When you're in the conversation, what do you share? You share this understanding about this RPC pattern. But as you begin to talk, you can sort of level that up. One of the things that I have to mention, Leonard, my co-author on the next book, Leonard Richardson, who is working on the RESTful web APIs with me, Leonard's really come up with a brilliant idea. The documentation that we write, documentation is a real challenge for APIs, right? The documentation that we write is really a profile of how that API works. Let me describe to you how it works. And one of the cool things is we can make that profile more machine readable. And one way is to put links and forms in the message. That's how the API works. Another one is to create a sort of a discovery document. That's the way Google is doing a lot of these services. There's a company called Comcast that uses something like that. And then we can also create sort of the WSDL service model, right? Those are all ways to profile how it works. As we make the description more machine readable, it becomes more hypermedia-like. So improving our documentation sometimes is actually cutting it down, just like any other interface. Apple taught us, how do you make the interface simple? You get rid of buttons. How do you make documentation better and simpler and more understandable? You start to get rid of it, and you put it in the message itself. And I think that's a really smart idea that Leonard has that we'll talk about in that book.
Okay. I guess actually to look at the book for a minute. So you're almost done with RESTful web APIs. And,
Yep.
It's a major change from the original RESTful Web Services book. I'm kind of curious, as you went through that, it's been a few years since the original book. That was Leonard and Sam Ruby. What kind of big stories did you see changing? And, you've been at this for a while. I'm just kind of curious if there's anything that you really found new and different when you went to write it up in the book.
Yeah, actually, I think we did, and I have again. I'm going to give a lot of credit to Leonard because he really is the arc. You know, Sam and Leonard wrote that book. I think it was released in 2008, and it was really the very first book that sort of codified this notion of Fielding's REST and how to apply it to the web. And at that time, we really weren't sure, if SOAP was a big thing or not. So that book focused a lot on why SOAP may not be good and why this RESTful pattern may be instead. One of the things we've learned over those years now is the approach that we took back in 2008 was very resource focused. Design a resource and figure out how to use methods against it, and then design a message that carries the information you need both forward and back. Over the years, one of the things that's changed is we're not so much focused on the resource now, but the thing we're trying to do, the action we're trying to take. And I think that's why Hypermedia works, because Hypermedia describes here's how you create a record, here's how you delete a record, here's how you modify a record, here's how you create a report or calculate this value. So what you're going to find, readers who've read the services book, and it's still a great book, and are reading now the updated version of this story, they're going to see a shift from starting from a resource point of view to shifting to starting from an action point of view. That's sort of the message in the media type pattern. The other one that I think is new in this book is what we're calling the semantic challenge. So one of the great things about HTTP is it sort of creates a generic protocol. We call it CRUD, but you can just use it as a general way. I can put, post, update, and delete. But that doesn't tell me why I would do it, right? Mm-hmm. That's just a generic thing. That's why the browser works. Browser doesn't understand anybody's problem domain. In the machine world and in the enterprise world, we have to understand that. So one of the fears is that we would all create our own message types. Everybody would have a message type. And all of a sudden now there's really not a lot of shared understanding because everything's a snowflake. Every media type, is just for one problem. But what I think we're finding is that you can actually apply semantics in a general way, the way you would apply protocol. You can apply sort of the domain problem. Like this is a user, this is a customer. What's at the other end of this? What the other end of this is a list of warehouses. We've looked at a thing called the Constrained Application Protocol, COAP, which is really a sort of an HTTP-like protocol that's very RESTful. But it's not HTTP. It's over UDP, and there are lots of other features. There's a whole chapter about it. And one of the things that does is it applies the same principles, but they have a very smart sort of semantic way of looking at it so that you can actually tell what's at the other end of a link ahead of time, which we can't really do very easily in the way that we do HTTP today. So I think what you're going to see in the book is this focus on actions, this focus on hypermedia, and this focus on pinning down the semantic differences. One of the great things about the RDF community, the RDF world, the linked data world, is they focused on semantics for a long time. One of the weaknesses they had is they didn't focus a lot on protocol, or a protocol was always an assumption. On the website, we've always kind of focused on create, read, update, delete, but not a lot on semantics. So a lot of the things that will happen in this book sort of bring those two together, which is also where they came from, right? Because RDF has been around for more than a decade as well. It came out of the same thinking from the W3C that we got HTTP from. So that's actually, I think, the most exciting part of the book for me.
Great. And I guess kind of one last question, which is, looking forward, you just mentioned, there are alternatives to HTTP these days. There's the CoAP, there's the netkernel 1060 work. There's continuing work on HTTP itself, both with Speedy and with HTTP 2.0. So, after over a decade of HTTP being very, very stable, do you see these changes and proposals making any great impact on kind of the world of RESTful hypermedia applications?
Yeah, actually, I think I do. I think, first of all, for HTTP, we're just about to see BIS get released. That'll probably happen later this year. That's just, sort of a clarification of the 2616. And as you mentioned, 2.0 is coming along. 2.0 will go binary, start to do some efficiencies, maybe solve head-of-line blocking and some other things. But both of those won't actually change the protocol rules. So those are going to be with us for a long time. HTTP 2.0 probably won't really see the light of day for a couple of years yet. So we've got still lots and lots of time on this line. But you mentioned CoAP, there's NetKernel, there's a couple other things that are really geared towards sensor devices, some other protocols and formats. We haven't even really talked about, WebSockets. So there's still WebSockets, and that's going to continue. We sort of dropped off the list of event notification systems and EBI, but WebSockets brings us all back to that same space again. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. The cool thing is on all those things we described, you can still use Hypermedia, right? I actually have done a couple of sample apps using Hypermedia messages over WebSockets. Those controls actually become the message that you're sending, when you do a send and so on and so forth. There's some very, very cool stuff. We have lots and lots of opportunity in that space. So I think one of the things that I started doing 3 or 4 years ago is sort of discussing the difference between the REST model and the Hypermedia technique. And I think now we're seeing a lot of people focus on the Hypermedia technique, and we can apply that to lots of models, not just the stateless REST protocol pattern. We can apply it to other stateful patterns or other formats. So there are lots and lots of cool opportunities ahead. And I think if we focus on some of these techniques separately than any particular style, remember Fielding just made this style as an example of one. We'll see lots of styles develop, some new protocols develop that use those styles, and we'll still be able to use Hypermedia on all that stuff. So I think there's lots and lots of exciting stuff ahead.
Great. That sounds like life is going to be exciting for a while. We'll be seeing you at the Fluent conference at the end of May.
Right.
Just any brief thoughts on what you'll be talking about for that fairly web-centric JavaScript audience?
Yeah. So for that talk, I'm going to be talking totally about the client side of Hypermedia and RESTful style. We have lots of books on writing servers, right? But we don't have a lot of good guidance on writing clients yet. So the title of the talk is, I think it's called Creating Hypermedia Clients. It's not rocket science. And we'll talk about the difference between human-driven clients and, sort of machine-driven clients. And we'll do it from a focused JavaScript perspective. You can write all those kinds of things in browsers today. The browser is a very powerful platform. So we'll just focus on clients. And I think that's where we're going to see lots of new stuff over the next year or so. And we'll just kick it off.
Okay, great. Looking forward to seeing it. Just a few weeks away. And thank you very much, Mike.
No problem. Take care.